Wolfgang has vested me with great power here because none of the panelists know who's coming next, and so I can surprise them. We had here a actually pretty positive talk about private diplomacy and a fairly circumspect talk about public diplomacy. So now we'll turn to the military and hear from Brigadier General Nicholson.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm here representing General Petraeus, who regrets he couldn't attend. He's kind of busy elsewhere at the moment. But a great personification of the military's role in diplomacy, and that being the topic here. There's many things I could address, Afghanistan in particular. I know the next panel will be on Afghanistan. When we get to the Q&A, if there are any questions on Afghanistan in particular as relates to this topic or anything else, I'd be happy to take those. And that's where my experience has been of late. I'm currently in the Pentagon, but have served in eastern and southern Afghanistan as a commander of U.S. and multinational forces there, currently working policy for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the Pentagon, and then will return in 4 weeks to Kabul to be General Petraeus' operations officer. So just to give you the context for my experience and my perspective as we talk about this role. So what I thought would be interesting as we look at the subject of diplomacy and crisis diplomacy, I suppose you could say there's been a few occasions of crisis diplomacy in Afghanistan of late, is to talk about the military's role in this, because it is, the military does have a role in diplomatic and development endeavors, certainly in the current context of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and our interaction with Pakistan. And so I just wanted to offer some perspectives on that as a point of reference to consider as part of this venue. First off, I'd say it's not ideal, it's certainly not traditional that the military would be involved in diplomacy necessarily. Yet that has occurred. So let me talk about some examples of how the military ends up getting involved in diplomacy. Again, back to General Petraeus, as a regional commander, as a combatant commander prior to his current duties in Afghanistan, he served as the U.S. Central Command commander, and as such is responsible for a geographic portion of the globe and all of the engagements with those governments and their militaries. So inherently, there is a diplomatic function involved in his duties, and this is the way we've structured it in the U.S. government. There's no corresponding State Department equivalent with the regional responsibilities in the field as he has, so there is a bit of a disconnect there. So by default, our military leaders at those levels, at the strategic level, end up being involved in diplomatic activities. Another example would be with respect to Pakistan. My current boss, Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is arguably our primary interlocutor with General Kiani. General Kiani, the head of the chief of the Army staff in Pakistan, but de facto has a role beyond that of a military chief with respect to the Pakistan government. And when you look at Pakistan as an example, here's a government that 4 years ago the military was running the country. Today you have a democratically elected government, albeit it's challenged. 4 years ago, a nation that did not, that saw its primary existential threat as India, today has added to that list of existential threats internal militancy, and the military, of course, has a leading role in dealing with that, even though we all know that many of the causes of that militancy are non-military in nature, and the challenges the government faces in connecting with its own people. So you have this blurring of the lines between military and civil leadership that occurs in many parts of the world, and our military leaders at the strategic level end up quite often dealing with these issues in their roles as interlocutors with the leaders of these other nations. But it's not just at the strategic level. If you take it down to the operational level, and again look at, let's take Afghanistan as an example. We are operating in a counterinsurgency context. So in a counterinsurgency context, security is necessary but not sufficient to win. So even though we have a large military presence in Afghanistan of 100,000 troops, that in and of itself is not going to bring us success in this conflict. The ability of the Afghan government to connect with their own people and then to become self-sustaining is what will lead to accomplishment of our long-term objectives. So in this kind of situation, however, if you look at the resourcing, and we'll have, I know you'll have Ambassador Eichenberg here later today, and he can certainly speak to this in greater detail. 100,000 U.S. troops, 1,000 U.S. civilians and the government. So a tremendous disparity. Many of those civilians are in Kabul, focused on assisting the Afghans with the standing up of their central government ministries and so forth. So in the field, now when you get down to the tactical level, where we're trying to actually affect this nexus between the people and their social forms of governance and this government, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, this nexus and the management of that connection often falls to military leaders at the tactical level. And why is that? It's because we don't have adequate civilian capacity on the ground, and many of you are familiar with the way we as a government have chosen to resource our diplomatic corps over the years, and the numbers are really inadequate for the task at hand, as certainly in Afghanistan. So military leaders end up then being involved in kind of inherently non-governmental functions or non-military functions at the lower levels, but it's absolutely necessary for them to accomplish their mission. Now I'd argue that this is not all bad. So, for example, if you have a military commander working with a government leader at the local level, there's a number of things that the military leader brings to it. He brings skills in leadership, management, and so forth. So when it comes to some of the hard skills necessary for government, there are some things that the military leader brings to the table. Obviously, there's many skill sets they don't possess, and then they do their best to fill in the blanks. But clearly, we've been drawn into this role. We embrace it because military guys tend to be can-do people, and they see a job that needs to be done, and they tend to step up and try to get it done. And often they do quite well. Let me back up a notch to the operational level and talk the issue of development, because this is an interesting one as well. Again, in a counterinsurgency context, what we're trying to do is one, conduct security operations to separate the enemy from the people, and then within that secure environment that we provide, we attempt then to effect a connection between the government and the people, while we're building government capacity and continuing to secure the environment. In theory then, eventually, as the indigenous nation builds up its own capacity for security and its own capacity for governance, then we step back. And arguably this process, in the case of Afghanistan, is going to be captured in this concept of transition, which will be a subject at Lisbon here next week, or at the end of next week, and NATO addressing the definition of transition and looking ahead towards the process of transition. So, but back to this role then. So the military then moves into a newly secured area, connects with the people, and then turns to their Afghan government partner, and if there is one, it's typically one individual who's been recently appointed to this area, may not have any formal training, and now that person is the government. So if you're the Afghan tribal elder, you have a form of social governance that's been pretty resilient for the last couple of 100 years. You have shuras, you've been elected by your tribal members, you're essentially an elected representative. You have great social legitimacy. This individual who walks in from the government represents a brand new government. In fact, he represents the fifth form of government you've seen in the last 30 years. You had a monarchy, you had communism, you had some sort of anarchy, theocracy, and now democracy. Okay, what's democracy? So there's a credibility issue, a legitimacy issue, as well as a capacity issue. So this connection's not automatic. And so that local military commander, who's usually a young captain or even a lieutenant, is out there trying to affect this nexus, which is so vital to our success. So again, inherently, there are clearly diplomatic skills required for that, a diplomacy of a sort, but also nation building of a sort as well. So, but essential to our success, because security alone will not win this. We will not, as you've heard many times, that's not about killing our way to victory. I mean, General Petraeus has used that term. We are again trying to help the Afghans secure the environment and so forth, so they can move forward. So I mention that because it's important to remember as we look at the success of these endeavors, going forward. The final thing I'd say, final point again, Afghanistan's a great case study for this topic. There's many dimensions to this topic that are inherent in Afghanistan. The final piece I'd say is, I alluded to this kind of political evolution that's got to occur. As Professor Gosso mentioned previously, there are many reasons to be hopeful about what's occurring in Afghanistan. And I say that from a military perspective, having served there most of the last 5 years. There are. We are probably, frankly, underselling those with a bit of intention. Better to undersell and overperform than the opposite. But nevertheless, I agree. If we risk losing public support, that clearly is a major concern. So we need to look closely at that. The final piece, though, is that this political evolution doesn't necessarily necessitate that we be there for that entire political evolution. Okay, we help them stand up their own security architecture. We help them establish a minimum level of capable and legitimate governance, and then we step back, and their political evolution continues to occur within that context. Thank you.